Hey everyone, it's Lori, and I am here today with my July reading wrap up. In the month of July, I read 10 books. 3 of those were physical books, and 7 of those were audiobooks, so it was a very audiobook heavy month for me again. This has kind of been my 2020. So I'm going to go ahead and just kind of go through what I read, give some thoughts on it. I'm going to start with the fiction books and then move into nonfiction. So the first fiction book I'd like to talk about is a middle grade novel, and it's actually more of a novelette. It's very short, and that's a Green Ember story, The First Fowler. This is from the Green Ember series by S.D. Smith. We have read all of these as family read-alouds over the years, and we read this one in one day, a Saturday, I think, maybe Sunday afternoon. Brett was able to stay home for quite a while, and we just read the whole thing. So that was kind of nice to just read an entire story. It's only about 100 pages long, so it's not a huge story, but we are now working on the final book in the Green Ember series, Ember's End. That's what we're reading aloud at the moment, but we did finish this one up in July. It took us a while to get to it. It's just been a weird year, so there's that. So that was one of the books I read. I enjoyed this one pretty well. Not my favorite of the Green Ember stories, but definitely worth checking out. It makes a good family read aloud. The second fiction book I'd like to talk about is The 7.5 Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle by Stuart Turton. So this is a unique kind of murder mystery book. So the narrator, the person you are following, wakes up and has no idea what's going on, who he is, etc. And slowly he figures out that he is living through multiple different people trying to solve this murder that was happening. So he's supposed to kind of figure out who the murderer is, and if he figures out who the murderer is, then he gets to be released from this situation. It's quite a unique concept for a novel, and I enjoyed it a lot. The fact that it wasn't very linear made it a little complicated at times, because you have not just you're being placed into the narrators being placed into all these different characters at different points in the story, and that would be one thing if it was like day 1 complete, day 2 complete, but every time he falls asleep he jumps to a different person. So there's a couple times where somebody takes a nap or whatever, is knocked unconscious. And so he doesn't complete that day. So later on, when he falls asleep again, he goes back to that. So it's just a very unique format for the book. It was very enjoyable to listen to. Definitely not the most mind-blowing book I have ever read. But, it was an enjoyable experience. And it's one that I would recommend if you're looking for kind of just a fun murder mystery, what's going on sort of book. I thought it was a good premise and written in a very interesting manner. Next, I also listened to Frankenstein. I did the earlier version of Frankenstein. The Close Reads podcast was doing, I can't remember if it's 1818 maybe, whatever the original Frankenstein edition was. Close Reads was doing a reading of that, so I listened to that along with listening to all the podcasts. I have about a half hour left in the Q&A session to listen to that I just didn't finish this morning. But Mary Shelley is such an interesting author, and learning more about her biography through listening along to the podcast really helped me to appreciate Frankenstein more. It is the first time I've ever read Frankenstein. My familiarity with Frankenstein was very low. I did know, because my husband read it in a class in college that, like the monster isn't Frankenstein. Frankenstein is the scientist, and some basic things that kind of get skewed because of so many different movie versions that make us think of Frankenstein as the monster, and so forth. So, and it was very interesting hearing some of the differences between the earlier version of Frankenstein and then the later edited text when Mary Shelley kind of rewrote it a little later on in life. Hearing some of those differences was an interesting experience because I can't think of very many books where you have two different versions that have fairly significant differences in how they play out. I mean, the overall storyline is the same, but some of the details shifted a bit as Mary Shelley got older. And it is pretty amazing that she wrote the edition that I was listening to when she was 18 years old. So, definitely a good work, one that I would consider reading again someday, and definitely worth the time to listen to all the Close Read podcast episodes that go along with it. The last fiction book I have was Brown Girl Dreaming by Jacqueline Woodson. And this is one that has been on my radar for a long time. It's been on my Goodreads, want to read shelf for I don't even know how long, years, honestly. And I just had never gotten around to it. I enjoyed this book. This is another audiobook that I listened to. I really think that I am not the target audience for this book. And while I appreciated it and I enjoyed it, I really think that honestly my daughter Eva will like it better than I did. And not saying I didn't like it, but it just wasn't something that hit home for me the way I think it would for Eva. So, very glad I read it, listened to it. I feel like it was relatively short. It took me a day or two to get through. But, it definitely, I think, will hit younger people in a different place than it hits me as kind of an older person. Okay, now I'm going to move into my nonfiction, and I guess I'll start off with all of the books that I read or listened to that were about the subject of race. So I will go ahead and start with two that are physical books, and then I will move into some audiobooks that I listen to as well. First up, I read White Rage by Carol Anderson. This is one that I had purchased along with the next book I'm going to talk about, hoping to kind of do a read along with Books with Shay. It took forever for my copies to get here, and there's actually a third book I ordered for Eva that just never got here, and I eventually had to cancel the order and just get a Kindle edition. This was my highest rated book this month. Carol Anderson goes into a lot of depth as to historical events and what those mean in terms of the racial divides in the USA today. So, last month, back in June, I guess it was, I listened to Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi, and that was very much a history book. And I enjoyed that one very much too. This one kind of pairs the history a little bit with more almost psychology thoughts. She is the chair of the African American Studies at Emory University. So she just goes through all of these different historical events and looks at them from the lens of how white people reacted and what the next step was for white people every time black people made a step forward. So I really enjoyed her take on things. It was very interesting, and I do highly recommend this one if you're interested in the topic of how we've gotten to the point we've gotten to in the United States with a very racially divided country that doesn't like to talk about race, essentially. The other one that Books with Shay was doing a read along for was White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And I actually put this off to the very end of the month because I had heard so many complaints about this book, and that it was problematic. So I haven't actually looked deeply into why people are finding this problematic. I know some of it is because it's a book about race written by a white person, and some people just have difficulties with that. Another difficulty people might have is if you use this as the only book you ever read on the topic of race. And I wouldn't suggest that either. I didn't find it problematic. Yes, it is a white person writing about race, and she is mostly writing about race for other white people. So I did find it kind of instructive because she does go into great detail about how sometimes white people think that they're doing enough and think they have all these excuses for why it's okay. Why, if they say something problematic, it's not really problematic because they're not really a racist. She points out that if you think of racism as just being like a racist person is a terrible person who just can't stand to be around people of another race at all, that's not what she's getting at. And she points out that like even white supremacists can have conversations and have to interact with black people throughout society and other races. So she points a little more deeply and says that as white people, we need to be a lot more careful to not get really defensive when someone points out something that we've said that is problematic, and that we need to not expect and not ask people of color to side with us, essentially, and say, you know, this person got mad at me for this, but they were just being unreasonable, and like trying to seek that validation from another person of color when these racial issues come up. So she suggests not doing that and perhaps talking it over with another white person, the issue that happened, before you go and like apologize for your problematic behavior. So rather than just assuming that what we do isn't problematic because we didn't mean it that way, sometimes it doesn't really matter whether you meant to be offensive. The fact that you offended is the problem. So I have been thinking about this quite a bit, and when I've been scrolling through Twitter, I've noticed recently quite a few people talking about people taking the time to learn to pronounce names correctly. And I know I'm guilty of that, particularly for authors, because I'm just lazy. I don't want to go look up how to pronounce names sometimes. So I'm going to try to do better about that myself, and not just fall back on the I'm not sure how to pronounce this thing, because that is just me being lazy. So I don't want to offend people by not taking enough time and enough care to research how to say a name. Like, obviously, if I am willing to read the book, I should be willing to go through enough research to look up how to pronounce a name correctly. And my last book about race in general is What Doesn't Kill You Makes You Blacker by Damon Young. This is a memoir by a black man talking about his life in terms of his race. And it was a very interesting book to listen to. I believe it was read by the author, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Pretty sure it was. Just learning all of the different aspects of his life that differ from aspects of my life just based upon his color and where he was raised and his class and the culture he was raised in versus myself was very interesting. This is not a book I would recommend for young readers. It does have a lot of swear words and some topics that I wouldn't find appropriate for my teenagers. You know, every teenager is different, so just keep in mind that this is one that I wouldn't just say have your teenagers read it. I would make sure you read it first to find out if you feel like it's something that would be appropriate for your teenagers. It's a very funny memoir too. He's got kind of a almost offbeat sense of humor that I really enjoyed, but just very small details of his life that would not have occurred to me growing up as I did. One particular incident that was interesting for me was that at one point he was applying for a job, and the job required a driver's license, but he didn't have a driver's license. He had not learned how to drive because when he was a teenager, like I learned how to drive at 15, 16 years old, they didn't have a car for him to drive, just all these barriers. And then he went off to college and he didn't want to admit to his friends that he couldn't drive. So for many years, he just pretended he had a driver's license that he just didn't like to drive. But kind of how it almost became a mental block for him getting his driver's license. He was so intimidated by the process, and I did kind of like how that culminated in him running into a kid that he had taught when he was substitute teaching, and saw this teeny tiny girl driving a car and realizing, okay, it can't be that hard if 16-year-olds do it, and going ahead and getting his license. But just the whole kind of concept of not getting your driver's license until well into adulthood, just like after college and everything, it's not something that I have much experience with, because most people I know got their license at 16, and if they didn't get it at 16, they got it at 18. I also grew up in Colorado, and Colorado does not have the greatest of public transportation, so living somewhere with better public transportation, maybe this would be a more relatable thing to people who do live places with really good public transit systems. But just all of his reflections on what it means to be Black and what it means to be a Black man, and then his reflections on raising his Black daughter, all of these things were just interesting to me from the standpoint of seeing beyond my own personal experience. Towards the end of the month, I just wanted something kind of short and funny, and so I checked out Is Everyone Hanging Out Without Me by Mindy Kaling, and she was in The Office, which I really enjoyed that show. It's very, very funny. So, and she seems to be a hilarious person from this memoir. So she starts off kind of pointing out that this book is pink. If it's taking you too long to read this book, there's a problem. But it's just kind of a lighthearted look at her life growing up, her kind of navigating her way as a comedy writer. I did not realize she was a writer for The Office. I guess I don't pay that much attention to who is listed as the writer for different episodes, but how she got to that point, and just kind of, it's a very interesting story in terms of she created her own everything. So rather than just like, she did go out and audition for a few things, but she and a friend wrote a play that they then performed in, and that's how her career kind of got launched. So she just has a fun way of looking at things, and talking about her upbringing. One of my very favorite parts of the book is she's talking about a boss that she had who liked to complain with her about how stressed she was, just under so much stress, and she kind of points out that being a child of an immigrant, her parents didn't think it was appropriate to talk about stress, so this whole bonding through talking about how stressed you are doesn't really make sense to her. And my favorite line was something about she doesn't understand this talking about stress or the concept of me time, and that's something that I feel, I know that a lot of people talk about how they need some me time and whatever, and it's never been something that I've been like, oh, I need some me time. Sometimes I do want to get away from everything, but just the concept of me time, I don't know. I'm with Mindy Kaling on this one, that me time is kind of a weird thing. So it was a fun, short little book to listen to, and it is read by the author. And but there's like these question and answer things, so I don't know who does the question portion of her question and answers. But it was just a very fun, short book to read. Another book I listened to this month was Into the Planet, My Life as a Cave Diver by Jill Heinerith. I said I was going to do better on looking up names, and I didn't do that today, so bad me. Okay. So this is a memoir about her experience of being a cave diver. And I have some experience scuba diving. I am open water certified. That's about it. My father has like a master scuba diver, whatever certification or whatever it's called. And Eva is an advanced junior open water diver. So I do have a little familiarity, but cave diving is something that I will never do in my entire life. And this book just put the nails in the coffin for me. It's fascinating, all of the dives she does, and all of the research, and how cave diving works with, you have ropes and you kind of place them along. So if you get to the end of a thing, you tie on and you go off. And just the details of how many tanks of air and the special rebreather technology. And then there's even this whole part about like diving in the Antarctic, where she almost dies multiple times. There's a lot of like almost death in this, and then there's a lot of deaths of people she knows, because apparently cave diving is just such a dangerous sport, such a dangerous activity, that if you are in the cave diving world, you will eventually have friends die while cave diving. And then there's even some cases where she's involved in body recoveries of other cave divers. So I don't want to cave dive ever, but it was fascinating to listen to. The last book I'd like to talk about is by Fredrik Backman, and that's Things My Son Needs to Know About the World. Now, this is a short nonfiction book. I have read a little bit of Fredrik Backman. I read in the last couple months, My Grandmother Asked Me to Tell You She's Sorry, and that was pretty good, but it took me a long time to get through. And I think the other one that I read was called A Deal of a Lifetime, and that was fabulous and made me want to read more Backman. This was just another one that I wanted something a little more lighthearted and not so long, and so I checked this out. This was another audiobook, so I did listen to this one, and my husband is listening to it now because I told him he should. I don't know exactly what I expected, but it's not quite what I expected. I thought it was going to be a lot more serious, things my son needs to know about the world. But it's a very light-hearted book, so it has these little stories, and Backman is trying to, put some truths out there for his son and for whoever reads, through kind of funny stories. So he talks about how, everybody fights at IKEA. I've only ever been to an IKEA once, and yeah, I think we probably had a fight while we were in IKEA. I don't know what it is about IKEA that makes it so stressful, but he points out that fights at IKEA are never about the stuff at IKEA. It's not about the bookcase, it's about something else. And that was very interesting. And then he talks about, another one I really enjoyed was, he talks about why God allows wars and bad things to happen. And he starts it from the airport baggage carousel and just goes from there. And just is so interestingly framed these things that he wants to get across. So I very much enjoyed the way Bachman kind of took little things from his life and pulled out a deeper meaning, and then came back around in a fun way. So I found the whole thing pretty funny, and enjoyable to read. So I guess that's all the books that I read in the month of July. Please let me know in the comments if you'd like to chat about any of these books further, or if you have suggestions for me. Feel free to click the subscribe button if you want to see my reading wrap-ups every month and the other videos that I come out with kind of sporadically. Other than that, I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe and stay safe and stay healthy. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.